Right. Well, did we want to get started?
Sure. Did you want me to start off then?
Sure.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sabine Alchidiak, and I'm the Educational Programs Manager at the Institute for Liberal Studies. We're an educational nonprofit, and we're based in Ottawa. We bring speakers on a diverse array of subjects, like the one you're going to be hearing about today, to campus clubs across Canada. Sadly, we can't physically be on your campus like we usually are with our speaker, but we are glad that we're able to do this over Teams nonetheless. I wanted to let you all know about some of the other programs we have going on that you might be interested in, including our 5-day long summer seminar called Freedom Week, where you can hear about and discuss classical liberal ideas in areas like economics, philosophy, politics, law, public policy from a faculty of distinguished professors. Applications are going to open up soon, so you can follow us on our socials or join our newsletter to get an update on when that opens up. We also host Socratic seminars and run a summer fellowship program, which offers paid internships at public policy and educational organizations across Canada. We have many other programs and events that I think you'll be interested in. You can check out our website for more on all of those. If you're interested in hearing more from other speakers, we run public talks every Friday at noon that you can register for on our website. I'll link to that in the chat as well. And we have one coming up this Friday, actually. And we also have a great podcast where we talk to different experts and thinkers every week. It's called The Curious Task. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. And actually, Professor Shahar has actually been a guest on this topic that he's talking about today, and I encourage you to check that out. Finally, we're giving away a few copies of the book Public Choice, a Primer by Eamon Butler. I'll put a link to that book draw in the chat for you all, and we'll mail it to the winners, and you're going to need a Canadian address for that. As for today's talk, I'm really looking forward to hearing from Professor Shahar. He's got such interesting things to say about the environment and our responsibilities, and he has been, as I said, a guest on our podcast, and I would definitely recommend you check that out. And without further ado, I'll hand things over to our co-hosts.
Thank you. Yeah, so just before we begin with our presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the land that Bishop's University in PISA rests upon. So the Abenaki people and the Wabanaki Confederacy are the traditional stewards of the area we have the privilege of studying on today. PISA is committed to bringing forward the voices and stories of those that have been so wrongfully silenced by the Government of Canada and federal institutions. But it is our goal to present a safe space for inclusive learning, and we hope that you will join us on a collective path towards reconciliation. So with that, this is PISA's last public event of the year. So as your acting director of events, I am eternally grateful for all of you joining us these past 2 semesters, and I look forward to keeping up with what PISA does in the future. But without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Donny Shahar, Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Research at the University of New Orleans and member of the Urban Entrepreneurship and Policy Institute. So his research focuses on the implications of environmental change, challenges for liberal societies and their members. And today he's presenting, well, I will let him talk about what he's presenting on today. So thank you again for joining us, and the mic is off to you, Dr. Shahar.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for having me today. I'm Donny Shahar. What I want to talk about in this presentation is the moral dimensions of living in harm's way. And in particular, I want to focus on the long-term dangers of climate change and individual responsibilities for the risks that people are going to be facing in a warming world. In particular, the risks that we all are going to be facing as citizens who are going to be inhabiting a world in which climate change is unfolding. So let me just start with a little bit of background. Over the last few decades, global average temperatures have risen by about 0.8 degrees Celsius, 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's extremely likely that human influences have played a major role in driving that trend, particularly since the latter part of the 20th century. But what happens from here is a bit more difficult to say, partly because the climate system is complex. We don't fully know all of the details of how it works, but partly also because the outcomes that we're going to be experiencing depend importantly on what people do to control their emissions. So when the United Nations makes projections through its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it actually considers, various different scenarios for how much we emit, how much we cut back on our emissions of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. So what you see on this chart are different emissions pathways into the future. The horizontal axis here is the year. The vertical axis is the amount of CO2 that is emitted in that given year. You can see that there are all sorts of different pathways that we could pursue, either continuing to grow, getting all the way down to zero, and any number of possibilities in between. And when you model these different scenarios, what you see is that the eventual increases in temperature that we're going to face are going to depend on how much CO2 ends up in the atmosphere. So here we have a chart with cumulative emissions of CO2 on the horizontal axis, and then the temperature change on the vertical axis. And you can see a kind of tight relationship here, where the more CO2 that's in the atmosphere, the more warming we should expect to see. Now, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change runs models with no policy interventions to try to control global climate change, what these models turn up is an average of 3.66 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. And those create losses in 2100 corresponding to about 2.6% on an annual basis of global domestic product, GDP. But notice, right, that's only the average result. The models include lots of different possibilities for, how different parameters are set up, different kinds of chance events that might happen. And depending on, how exactly those parameters get specified, you can end up with very different outcomes in different runs of the model. So, one way to think about it is like, does a hurricane hit Miami? If so, then that, is one scenario. If there is no hurricane that hits Miami, then that's a different scenario. And so, you run the model lots of different times, you get very different outcomes. And in the worst 5% of runs, the losses due to climate change work out to more like 8.2% of GDP or more per year. And that might sound small, 8.2%. But remember, world GDP, is many trillions of dollars. And, so 8.2% of many trillions of dollars is a lot of damage. And what that looks like in practice is more and worse fires, floods, heat waves, and so on, right? Droughts every year, going on into the future. And so in mainstream discussions of climate change, these kinds of projections are typically interpreted in a particular way. And for the sake of this talk, I'm going to call this the typical gloss on the moral problem of climate change. So according to this typical gloss, short of a political miracle, climate change is going to cause trillions of dollars of damage into the future, right? Potentially many trillions of dollars every year. And I'm talking here in dollar terms, but you can make the same point in terms of deaths, displacements, people being forced to move, right? Any number of different ways of making this point, but basically the same idea, right? And the thought is this is a morally bad thing, right? It involves people today inflicting major harms on future people, right? And there might be some complicated questions to be asked about, who we should blame most or less for these impacts, what exactly we should do about it. But there's general agreement that the people who are contributing to this problem today are morally on the hook for these harms that are being inflicted on people in the future. And insofar as we are in this situation where people today are inflicting wrongful harms on future people, the upshot is that we should take action to reduce these harms. To fail to do that would be morally wrong, right? So I take it that this is the kind of standard narrative on the ethics of climate change that you'll hear in most sort of mainstream outlets. I take it that all of you are, more or less familiar with this kind of view from your participation in civil society. What I want to argue in this talk is that this narrative is not wrong, but is nevertheless misleading. And the problem with this way of thinking about climate change has to do with the way that it leads us to think about the moral significance of climate-induced harms. I want to argue that this standard way of thinking distorts our understanding of the ethical significance of the harms that climate change is going to cause. So harm is a central, concept in morality. It's arguably the paradigmatic form of wrongdoing. So here is little bunny Fufu. He's scooping up innocent field mice. He's potentially giving them concussions. He is clearly a horrible individual. He's rightly punished for his terrible behavior. But not all harm is as straightforwardly immoral as this. So consider these people, for example, who are opening a new business. For all we know, there might be some guy down the street who's going to lose lots of customers as a result of this business opening and be made worse off by that. And plausibly, this other business owner would be harmed by the fact that these competitors are moving in. But that harm is not necessarily a morally significant wrong, right? These people have a right to open their business. And if that makes the competing business worse off, right, that's the competitor's problem, not theirs. And likewise with this woman who's trying to enjoy this beautifully layered cocktail when this lonely fellow at the bar decides that he wants to start up a conversation with her, right? If she tells him to get lost, and leave her alone, plausibly that's going to harm him. He's going to be made much worse off than he might otherwise have been. But just as obviously, it seems clear to me, at least, that it is not morally wrong for her to do that, to tell him to get lost and just go on with her night. So what we see from cases like this is just that if by harm we mean something straightforward like adversely affect or make worse off, right? Some harms are going to just turn out not to be very significant for morality, right? So even though harm is a central moral concept, the moral significance of harm can vary from case to case depending on the details of the circumstance. Now, on the other hand, I do want to stress that just because a particular harm is not immoral, not wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not tragic or unfortunate, right? So if this guy, gets put out of work because the competing business opens up down the street and takes his customers away, right? That might be a tragedy that maybe we shouldn't ignore. Maybe we even want to help this guy out. And even the creepy guy at the bar, right, he might have to endure the rejection and loneliness that comes with being told to get lost, right? Maybe he has no moral complaint about any of this. It's completely within the person's right to tell him to leave her alone. But nevertheless, we don't have to necessarily ignore the sort of hardships that this person has to deal with as a result of the harm. So the point is just that these cases all illustrate how it's possible that a harm can be tragic or sad or unfortunate without it being the case that a moral wrong has been done to anybody or by anybody. They also illustrate one reason why harm can be morally insignificant. So in particular, right, harm isn't wrong when it comes from people legitimately exercising their rights. That's what's going on in these kinds of cases. But there are other kinds of harms that have a reduced moral significance as well. In particular, for this talk, it's going to be important that the moral significance of a harm is diminished if its victims either voluntarily put themselves into harm's way or neglect to get out of harm's way when they have ample opportunity to do so. So let me expand on what I mean by that. Here's just an example. So imagine I go to a baseball game and in a moment of distraction, I'm eating my hot dog and I get hit in the head by a foul ball. Now, I could be seriously harmed by that, right? But it wouldn't necessarily mean that I'd been wronged, people who go to baseball games by their own choice, right, they voluntarily assume certain kinds of risks. And if those risks eventuate, it might be tragic for those people, but not necessarily because a moral wrong has been done to them. And notice that what's doing the work in a case like that is not some independently legitimate exercise of rights, right? Nobody has a right to just send baseballs flying at random people's heads. If I'm walking down the street and somebody just hits a baseball into my skull, right, plausibly that person is going to be responsible for the harm that they do. What makes a case like this one morally innocuous is that people are only harmed because of risks that they voluntarily took on. So that was a case where harm is less significant from a moral point of view because of a voluntary assumption of risk. But here's a different case. So imagine you're on a hike up a mountain, and suddenly a mountain biker comes speeding around the corner, totally out of control. She sees you in the path and she shouts, watch out, get out of the way. And let's say she's going too fast to stop. But suppose that you have plenty of time to just step to the side and get out of the way before she hits you. But then suppose you decide not to move, and instead you just get plowed into. Now, this is an example where you didn't voluntarily put yourself into danger, right? The mountain biker did that by riding her bike recklessly down this trail. But even so, it seems like the moral significance of this harm that you've endured is at least reduced by the fact that you didn't move, even though you had ample opportunity to do that, right? And so the point I just want to make about cases like these is that the moral significance of a harm is diminished if the victims either voluntarily put themselves into harm's way or neglected to get out of harm's way. And notice that I'm saying diminished and not eliminated, right? So in the mountain biker case, very plausibly, the biker bears some of the responsibility for behaving recklessly and, endangering you. The point is just that compared to a case where you're harmed just without warning as an innocent person who, was just sort of beamed in the head with a ball, right? The moral gravity of harm is going to be significantly reduced if the victims had some opportunity to either get out of the way or stay out of the way. So, okay, now let's think about how all of this applies to the case of climate change. So I talked about more and worse floods and fires and heat waves and droughts and so on, right? Trillions of dollars in damages every year. But notice the time scale on which these damages are projected to occur, right? So there's lots of evidence that climate change is already having impacts on people around the world. But the most severe effects that are expected are going to be unfolding over a number of decades. Right? And what this means is that a lot of the people who are going to be victimized by climate change are going to have been aware of the problem for many years, and they'll have had decades to prepare for the possible impacts that they'll face. Right? So just to take one example, right, here's a city on the coast that's eventually going to be threatened by rising sea levels and increased storm flooding and other kinds of things like that. Right? It already faces some risk of those problems today. But in 50 or 100 years, those risks are going to be a lot higher. But if you look closer at this city, right, you're going to see a lot of people moving in and out of the city over the next 50 or 100 years, right? The people who make up the current workforce of the city are going to be deciding where they want to spend their retirement. Their kids are going to be growing up and deciding where they want to build their lives. The properties that are eventually going to be threatened by climate change might change hands multiple times between, now and 50 years from now. A lot of the properties won't even exist yet, right? Existing assets are going to be torn down. New investments are going to be made in their place. And so given all of these things, it seems highly plausible that in 50 or 100 years, virtually everyone and everything that's going to be threatened in coastal cities like this one is going to have a link to some person's decision to either put themselves into harm's way or not move out of harm's way despite having an ample opportunity to do so. And if that's true, and if my earlier analysis was correct, then when climate change produces impacts like this, right, it's not going to be appropriate to think of them the way that we think of a lot of ordinary cases of harm. Right? They'll be a lot less like somebody being attacked by a hammer-wielding rabbit in the forest, a lot more like the baseball fan who got hit by a foul ball after she chose to go to the game. So let me just present a younger version of myself as an illustration of this. So until the summer of 2019, I was teaching at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. If I had stayed in North Carolina, I would have been protected from a lot of the worst impacts of climate change, right? Not all of the impacts, because really everybody is going to face some risk in a warming world, but inland North Carolina is not going to be the epicenter of the global climate crisis. However, I was offered a position to come down to the University of New Orleans. And so, I moved to the Gulf Coast. Among American cities, New Orleans is maybe uniquely threatened by climate change for a variety of reasons. But here's the thing, right? I knew that before I moved. I voluntarily put myself into harm's way. And so my claim is that if, the city faces a climate catastrophe after I've made this decision to move here, then I'm going to bear at least some responsibility for the fact that I took on those additional risks. And the point I'm trying to make more broadly is that if we fast forward to the year 2100, right, that same thing is going to be true for a lot of the people who are threatened by climate change. They're going to be in harm's way because they made choices that came with certain kinds of risks. And to the extent that that's true, the moral gravity of the harms that they endure is going to be significantly reduced. Now, you might be thinking, okay, maybe that's true for people like you, Donny, who have the luxury to choose, where and how you're going to live your life. But lots of people in the world are not so fortunate, right? Hundreds of millions of people around the world still live on less than $2 a day. Around half of the world's population lives on less than $5.50 a day, so about $2,000 a year, right? Not a lot of money to be making, big decisions about moving all over the world. And if you're a subsistence farmer in rural Bangladesh, it's not super fair for us to say, oh, I'm sorry that your crops failed and your house is flooding, right? Didn't you realize climate change was happening? Didn't you, think about moving somewhere else that had fewer risks? Obviously those are tough questions to put to anybody, but I don't think they're completely out of place for people who live in cities like this, right? These are people who have lots of choices about where they're going to live, where they're going to work, once we're thinking on time spans of decades and centuries. These people also tend to know that climate change is coming. They have lots of options for protecting themselves. But people who live in places like these aren't always choosing to be in harm's way, right? They're often in harm's way because they don't have much of a choice. And there are lots of reasons why people might find themselves stuck in harm's way, right? They might not have enough material wealth to make really robust decisions about where are they going to live and how are they going to structure their economic lives. They might not have enough education to really understand what risks they're going to face as a result of climate change, or what their options are for responding to those risks. They might face political and legal barriers to mobility, right? They might just not be able to pick up and move because of the laws that are in place, whether in their country or in surrounding countries. And so even if it's true that somebody like me is responsible for the harms I incur because of my choices about what to do about climate change and what to do about my life, the same thing is not necessarily going to be true for people who face these kinds of challenges, right? When people have obstacles like those, right, the burdens that are imposed on them by climate change aren't going to be like the injuries caused by foul balls to people who chose to be at baseball games, right? They're going to be a lot more like the case of the field mice and the bunny foo-foo story, right? People who are out just doing the best that they can, and current emitters of greenhouse gases are basically just wrongfully sending harms in their direction that they don't really have much opportunity to avoid. So I want to grant all of that. And it does highlight some limits of the kind of analysis that I was presenting earlier about the sort of morality of avoiding harm. But I don't actually see this as a problem for my view. In fact, I think it shows why the view is so important and why it should change the way that we respond to the problem of climate change. So let's just go back to the standard gloss on the ethics of climate change that I presented earlier to see why. So on that account, the problem of climate change is that we are basically, creating massive harms for future people. And the solution that seemed to follow straightforwardly was that we just need to find ways to reduce that harm. What I'm arguing is that this is a misleading way to think about the issue. A lot of the harms that are going to be caused by climate change are of much less moral significance than we might think, right? Particularly for people who live in places like this, and where the bulk of the responsibilities for the burdens that they face lies in their hands, given the choices that they've made about how to live their lives. The real and most important problems of climate change have to do with obstacles like these, right? These are the things that make it infeasible for people to get out of the way of climate-induced harms, right? And if that's right, then contrary to the sort of standard narrative, our moral imperative is not so much to reduce harm itself, right? It might turn out that a better way of tackling the problem of climate change in many cases would be to focus on addressing these sources of vulnerability in the first place, right? Helping people to improve their access to material wealth, to allow them to make more robust choices about their lives. Help people have more education, better access to information about climate change, again, so that they can make more robust choices. Eliminate barriers to these people moving around, right? If we remove these kinds of obstacles to people taking control over their own lives, then we enable them to take more responsibility for what risks they face in a warming world. And for all we know, a lot of these people might use their new opportunities to move to places like this, right? They might do what I did and move to New Orleans, right? And if that's true, right, if lots of people, when given more options and more empowerment, decide to put themselves into harm's way, it might just turn out that an effective climate policy actually results in more people being harmed, right? More people being harmed because they took on more risks. But the point is just that if they do get harmed in that kind of case, it'll be because of the choices that they've made and the choices that the risks that they've decided to take on. And so the moral gravity of the harms that they experience is going to be significantly reduced. And so instead of simply trying to sort of reduce harms as such, what my approach recommends is empowering people to choose what risks they want to bear in a warming world. And that might not actually lead to a reduction in overall harm, but it would lead to a reduction in the kind of harm that's most morally problematic. So just to summarize what I've been arguing in this talk, a lot of climate change-induced harms are going to have significantly diminished moral significance compared to the kinds of harms that we experience, in most of our day-to-day lives, because they will result from people voluntarily either putting themselves into harm's way or not getting out of harm's way despite having ample opportunity to do so. The most serious harms of climate change are going to be the ones that affect people who can't get out of the way because they face, various kinds of obstacles having to do with wealth, education, barriers to mobility, and so on. So a more sophisticated response to climate change would focus not just on minimizing harm as such, but rather on empowering people to make more robust choices about the kinds of lives they want to live and the kinds of risks they want to take on in a warming world. So thank you guys so much for listening and for coming out. I'm Donny Shahar again. I look forward to a great conversation with you guys.
Thank you so much. That was really, really informative, and I think a really important perspective on an issue that we seem to talk about nearly every day, but that maybe doesn't get the right kind of attention. So I'm going to open up. I think the chat is already open, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, I think everybody now has the ability to unmute themselves. So if you'd like to raise your hand and speak your question, that would be great. Let me just make sure that the chat is on. In the meantime, I have a quick question for you, Dr. Shahar.
Yeah.
So it seems like a lot of this talks about sort of an individual responsibility, but something that I think is really interesting when we talk about, when you were talking at the end about a more robust policy to combat climate change is whether or not people actually see these consequences. So to us, it's obvious. To us, we see, how climate change is going to affect our lives by the year 2100. But it feels like a lot of policymakers and a lot of those empowered to make the changes to empower people to get out of harm's way don't actually recognize the consequences of these actions. So how would you address that issue? And do you think that that's actually the case, or just the media reinforcing a few key people that don't believe in the issues at hand?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. I wish I had more insight on, how to make more progress in that domain. I think probably to the extent that, there are lots of people who, sort of present themselves as skeptical about the existence of climate change or the existence of these problems. I think a lot of that comes from a place of distrust of certain sources of information, certain advocates of certain kinds of policies, and so finding ways to overcome that distrust is really going to be at the heart of any effective strategy. And so just sort of telling people again and again what the reality is, if they don't trust you and they don't think that you're on the right wavelength, you can sort of talk yourself blue before you're going to accomplish very much. But the other thing to say is just that some resistance on these kinds of issues undoubtedly sort of is linked to a sense that people don't really see what a good solution would look like. And so they're kind of reluctant to just go down this road of indulging the arguments of people who maybe want to implement policies that they don't support. So one dynamic of the global policy situation with respect to climate change that's kind of difficult is just that it's sort of an unfortunate feature of the climate problem that there's not really any one country that, like, by doing something they could solve the problem on their own. Particularly if you kind of look at the wealthy developed countries that often take themselves to have the strongest responsibilities for climate change, they're actually not responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. The majority of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from less developed countries now. And completely understandably, a lot of those countries are really reluctant to take aggressive action that might jeopardize their ability to continue to lift their populations out of poverty. So countries like China and India have been growing rapidly. It's a good thing that they're growing rapidly, but they're reluctant to do stuff that could threaten the prosperity of their people. And without action from them, particularly the United States, where I live, right, is not super excited to take on really costly measures that might accelerate, China getting to assume a position of global power, and kind of, hasten the end of American dominance, right? So, like, that's a thing that I don't know. I have no idea how you solve that, right? But if you don't solve that, then it's sort of like, well, telling people that climate change exists and that it's bad is like kind of neither here nor there to getting them to actually act. Because, the thing that they're reluctant to do is not to, like, stop harm. Everybody wants to stop harm. That's great. But it's more, an issue of, well, how do we navigate this policy arena without sacrificing the things that are really important to us?
Yeah, that's definitely an issue I think we see often, especially when it comes to the financial question for big countries and spending additional money on things that they don't see the necessity for, and especially if it seems to intervene with their national interest. The chat should be active. I noticed that it wasn't actually on, so if anybody else has any additional questions, please feel free to type them out. Speaking of the US, so you're American and obviously we're from Canada, so it's a different kind of political terrain from your perspective than it is from ours. But something that really strikes me with American climate policy is, of course, the Paris Climate Agreement and how the US left and denounced the Kyoto Protocol as well. But we've seen how generally neutral the agreement is in the first place, right? So when they've rejoined under the administration of Joe Biden, to me, it kind of begs the question of how fruitful these international agreements actually are, especially when they're non-binding and, in the case of Paris, completely dependent on what an individual state wants to do. So how would you kind of respond to things like Paris and Kyoto?
I mean, I guess when I think about these international, policy negotiations, I just think that, like, this is an area where it seems like the problems that I was just kind of describing, of like trying to figure out, like, how do you reconcile all of these different interests, it I think reinforces in my mind that, like, these are really hard problems to solve, and until you solve them, people aren't really going to be willing to take aggressive action. And it's not really going to matter, like, if Joe Biden is president, or Donald Trump or Barack Obama or George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or anybody. You kind of go back and forth with, like, political leaders and posturing in different ways about what they're going to do to solve this problem. But, like, at the end of the day, everybody gets to the negotiating table and they say, well, look, like, here's where we're willing to go. We're not willing to go any further than that. And I think what's needed is, is a kind of, like, entrepreneurship or inventiveness, being able to actually see options that people don't appreciate. And until somebody comes up with what the solution should look like and figures out a new way to actually reconcile these different competing interests, you can kind of you can have all of the negotiations you want, right? People aren't going to buy in. So, like, the Paris Accord was an interesting beast because, the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement, really were sort of, I guess, hamstrung by this inability to figure out, well, how do you get both the wealthy countries to be willing to, to make these cuts, but also get the less wealthy countries to actually be willing to, to commit to do the things that the wealthy countries would want to see in return. And one big sticking point was the issue of, like, monitoring and quantifying of reductions. So, like, the United States delegation basically was like, look, we're not going to agree to make, like, a bunch of really aggressive cuts unless, China agrees to make cuts. And we don't want China to just agree to make cuts. We want to know how they're going to measure they're actually following through on that. Because we don't trust that if the Chinese government says, oh, sure, we're doing this, that's actually what's happening on the ground. And, at the time, there was no agreement on, how the Chinese government was going to monitor stuff and how other governments around the world were going to do this monitoring. And so what ended up happening was they ended up basically being like, all right, look, we need to salvage something. So here's the new agreement. Everybody just gets to do whatever they want. And, like, you aren't comfortable with us telling you that this is binding on you. You also aren't, like, China isn't comfortable. America's not comfortable. Australia not comfortable. And so why don't you guys just tell us what you are comfortable with, and we can go from there. Kind of a good idea. In a way, right? If nobody's comfortable committing to anything, then it might be that the best you can do is to get people to just commit to whatever they're going to do and try to ratchet up from there. What they didn't realize was that there would be politicians like Donald Trump who can actually score points with their own, political bases by, basically just saying like, no, bad deal for us, we're pulling out. And it's like, what was the deal? What, like, you aren't required to do anything that you don't want to do. So what exactly was so threatening to America about this policy? Well, nothing, but like, Donald Trump scored a lot of points with his base by saying, yep, I'm sticking it to these international bodies. We're going to get a better deal for America. We'll renegotiate. We'll come back with something better than this, and it'll help make America, better positioned in the world. That was something that I think nobody really anticipated. When I heard Donald Trump, make the announcement, I was just bewildered until I kind of thought about it. It was like, well, actually, I see what he's doing, but it's sort of unfortunate. But yeah, I mean, until you can kind of figure out, like, how do you get all of these interests aligned, these international agreements aren't going to go anywhere. I mean, Kyoto was even worse because in a way, like the Kyoto Protocol was like, all right, we're not going to ask the less developed world to do anything. The wealthy countries are going to take all of the cuts. But actually, most of the European countries, because they've had kind of economic stagnation over the period that we're looking at, they're not really going to have to make cuts that aggressively. The United States has grown a lot, so they're going to have to make a really aggressive cuts. And for any European countries that are going to have to make cuts, they can really just buy permits for emissions space from Russia, because Russia's economy tanked during the period that we're looking at. And so as long as you just buy permits from Russia, you are fine because they're in the same economic zone as the European Union. And so, the European countries were like, yeah, it's fine. We don't have to really do anything. We can just kind of do what we've been doing. And the less developed countries were like, yeah, this is great, right? But then the United States was like, so wait, let me understand. Nobody is going to do anything about climate change except for us. And the European countries are going to send a bunch of money to Russia. Like, this is the worst climate policy that I've ever heard of. Of course, I'm not participating, right? And so the Kyoto Protocol, sort of floundered for that reason. I mean, just because of sort of circumstances of how things developed as it was being negotiated and put into place. But, like, that was a really terrible attempt, I guess, at solving this problem. Not because, like, it wouldn't be great to find a solution, but because, like, people at the time, they just didn't have a good idea of what to do. So I don't know what to say by way of, like, solving these problems with the international negotiations, beyond just saying that until somebody actually figures out what a good solution looks like for everybody, like, we're not just demanding action is, I think, not the way to get anywhere on this.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. That was a really very well developed answer, and I think touches on most of the issues that we see in the news these days internationally. We have a question from Carrie Robinson, who says, "Thank you so much for coming to speak with us." Her question is, in your opinion, who is ethically responsible for combating climate change and reducing its effects for the future? Is it business owners, policymakers, world leaders, activists?
Yeah, good question. Thinking about, how responsibility is distributed for dealing with these, like, big collective action problems is something that I am really sort of fascinated by. It's one of the big areas that I work in, and unfortunately, I think the more I've studied this, the less I feel like I know how to answer that question. I mean, I think that so the way I think about this stuff in general is in terms of a kind of division of labor among activists, right? So when we think about our roles as individuals, there's a kind of tragedy that we face, that our world is just full of horrible problems. Climate change is one of them. It's a major one, but it's far from the only problem that merits attention. And it's just kind of a fact about the limits on our abilities, that we can't sort of personally tackle all of these problems in a really meaningful way. I mean, we can like say stuff on Twitter or whatever about everything we want, but if we really want to try and take action and make a difference, we kind of have to specialize. We have to focus on a few things, and not really necessarily take aggressive action on most of the problems that we know about and that we care about. And so that kind of puts individuals in a tricky position, in that like there are going to be lots of things demanding for us to like contribute to taking action on them. But it's not true that for any individual that like they have a specific obligation to take action on each particular cause. They might have an obligation to do something about something, but there's a choice to be made about like, do you want to be someone who focuses on criminal justice reform? Do you want to be someone who focuses on global poverty? Do you want to be someone who focuses on climate change? And so in terms of individuals' responsibilities, I think, it's hard to sort of point the finger at any one particular person and say, you have an obligation to take an action on this particular thing. I think when we're talking about businesses, it can be kind of more complicated, because at a certain scale, businesses themselves, I mean, most businesses are small, right? And so like, in a way, they kind of are in a similar position as individuals. But there are certain businesses that are just like huge, and they have, an influence on policy decisions. They have an influence maybe through their own activities, like in the case of large oil companies, like they might actually have a detectable impact through just what they decide to do on what the climate is going to do going forward. I think that kind of, that's a very different situation, in which case maybe, you might say that that maybe they do have more of a sort of specific obligation to address, the different impacts that they are actually having on the world, whether that's through their actions or through their inaction. And I think policymakers are kind of in a similar boat where, if you are a policymaker, you might actually be able to do something about these issues in a way that most individuals can't. But I think that even in these kinds of cases, right, there's still a kind of collective action problem where, like, if one big player decides that they are going to, go hard on this, and other players aren't willing to go along with it, they can take on, as much cost as they are willing to take on and not really solve the problem. And so, do they have an obligation to do that? Hard for me to, I just don't know what to say about that, in all honesty, but it at least is a more complicated case in my mind than the case of individuals, where with individuals, I really think that, there is broad latitude for what people have a right to do with respect to their efforts. When it comes to, bigger players, I think it's more complicated. Maybe they do have some obligation. when it comes to like entities like countries and things like that, I start to lose my grip even more, where it's like, what is a country like qua decision maker? Like, countries don't make decisions. Like, you've got all of these people who in one way or another are responsible for making certain kinds of decisions, whether individually, as in the case of like a president, or you know, as a group in the case of legislators or regulators or whatever. And you know, I think yeah, I wish that I had a better answer for what, you know, how we kind of put the responsibilities here. But I'm skeptical of being able to really give a specific answer. And one thing that means is that it might be kind of hard to, at the end of the day, figure out, like, you know, who is to blame for what, right? Suppose we don't solve the problem. Like, suppose that you know, lots of people work on this and people talk about it for a long time and they wring their hands, and then, you know, 50 years from now, like, nothing really has gotten done about it. Maybe innovations have been introduced that make the problem less severe, but you know, a lot of these harms are actually just materializing because they haven't been stopped. And like, who is to blame for that? I kind of think like it's hard to answer that question. I think probably everybody would have some reason to feel ashamed in that kind of outcome. I mean, you think about what it would have been like to be a member of, you know, the German citizenry after the Holocaust, right? A clear failure of social responsibility, and yet one where, like, as an individual citizen, like, what were you supposed to do? But it doesn't mean that at the end of the day, you don't sort of look back at that and be like, I'm disgusted to have been a part of the group that failed to solve this problem. I kind of think there's, you know, there's a lot of that's in store for us if we can't find a way to solve these problems, where, you know, maybe everybody kind of doesn't feel like they could have solved it, but nevertheless rightly feels ashamed that a solution wasn't found and that they weren't able to be part of that. And yeah, figuring out, you know, where to go from there is just hard.
So just to round off our conversation at the end here, would you, in that case, call yourself an optimist on the question of climate change? Do you think that this is a problem that we can solve, or are you more pessimistic about the whole thing? I imagine it must be tough to reconcile with being an expert in a field that you know, thinks about these issues every single day. So how would you kind of personally relate to the success or the failure of climate change in the future?
So, I mean, I guess I'm both in a way. I'm an optimist that the future is going to be okay. So, like, you know, a lot of the rhetoric around the climate crisis is, you know, this is like this existential risk that's going to, you know, like, threaten the survival of humanity. You know, these are things that I think line up with a particular narrative about humanity's place in the natural world and the impacts of our societies on nature. But I don't think that mainstream, you know, projections about the future of climate change really bear out that kind of view. I think if you look at pretty much any mainstream projection, the anticipation is that people in the future are going to be better off on average than people today, and that the greatest gains are going to be made by the people who are worse off today. And so, you know, that's good news, even with climate change. Even if we don't do anything about climate change, that's at least, you know, something that is being projected by pretty much everybody, including the people, you know, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN, including the Stern Report and all of the rest. So I'm optimistic about that, I guess. But I am pessimistic that, you know, So even if it's true that the future is going to be fine, right? It's not going to be as fine as it could have been if we just gotten our stuff together and, you know, dealt with this problem. And a lot of stuff is going to get lost. I mean, whole communities are going to be destroyed. Whole civilizations are going to be lost. You know, there are certain nations that will no longer exist, certain cultures that will no longer exist. Ecosystems are going to be destabilized. Species are going to be lost. You know, like, you can live in a world like that. And it's a shame to have to live in a world like that in a way, but you can. And I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of a pessimist that we're going to be able to avoid a lot of those really bad losses. Like, we're just going to have to watch as a lot of things that we could have saved aren't saved. And we're just going to have to live with that. And we will. People live with a lot of bad stuff. You know, I come from a family background where people have, you know, dealt with a lot of bad stuff. You know, like my mom's, you know, family moved over here from Russia, where people, you know, in my family were locked up in a house and burned alive for being Jewish, right? That was terrible, but people lived, right? And, you know, at the end of the day, they moved on, and it, like, you know, today I have the good fortune of living in a society that is beyond the dreams that any of those people, you know, could have had, right? And I think that's kind of like, you know, you think about climate change, it's not going to be like that exactly, but like, it's simultaneously a story of real loss and real horror, and also of things turning out okay, turning out okay for the survivors. And so I don't know, like, if that's an optimistic or a pessimistic view, or what you make of that. But I kind of think that's the way that you got to be able to think about it, is to see both of those things at the same time, the horrible losses, and also the ability to persist and to move on and to be even better than before.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I think this was incredibly informative and definitely very, very interesting. And, you know, I really look forward to seeing what else we have in store. I know you have a book that has come out in 2021. So what I'd like to do is link that to our social media so that people have access to your research to kind of see a little bit more of what you do. And thank you again to Sabine for working with PISA to make this happen. We really appreciate it. I guess that's it from me. And I look forward to another year of PISA. And I hope you have a great rest of your week and your year, Dr. Shahar and Sabine.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.